Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes, and with me as always, my fellow traveller in everything therapeutic, Mr. Ken Kelly. How you doing, Ken?
Oh, exceptionally well today. Excited for today's episode 88. We're really going to be bringing you some valuable information, starting off with reflective journal writing. That's always an interesting topic. We see that so often in the Facebook page, and more courses requiring a reflective journal to be written while you are training. In Practice Matters today, we're going to be looking at a very important subject, is working with clients who may be going through a court case. And Rory, I know that you have in your own private practice experienced this. Can you kind of share a little bit of what we might expect from that?
Yes, I'm going to kind of demystify what happens if you have a client who comes in and says, as part of what's happening, I'm also going through a court case. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about professional thinking around that and what you might have to put in place.
Like it, looking forward to that one. And then we are ending episode 88 today with speaking about disclosure of personal problems, personal issues that we may be facing as we are doing our training. How might we do that? Should we do that? How might we deal with them? But starting us off today, reflective journal writing, Rory.
Yes, and before we start, in my loft, in the loft at Counselling Towers, I've got all my assignments, everything from my diploma when I did it 15 years ago, and in it is my personal development statements and my personal journals. And occasionally, usually at Christmas when I go up to get the Christmas tree out, I have a quick look and I have a little bit of a laugh to myself. I think, is that the Rory that he was 15 years ago? Because a personal journal, the whole point of a personal journal, I think, is to draw a line in the sand of where you start on your own personal development, informed by the theories that you're learning. And I think that, if you're going through a counselling course, the theories that you learn will impact on your understanding of how you became to be the person you are. And there's fantastic shifts that go through during the arc of counselling. And that's why it's so important that students keep a personal journal, to be able to write down and reflect what's shifting and what's changing for them. And a lot of courses ask that as part of the course content.
Yes, mapping your journey is so important. I mean, a big part of training to be a counsellor, a psychotherapist, is looking at self. I remember going into training and thinking it was all about learning new theories and learning how to be with other people, and I was quite surprised to see what a large element of the actual training looking at self was. You have your personal development groups where you're going to be bringing self week after week and talking about what's going on in your life, and putting that down in a journal kind of maps that journey for you, and you're able to look back on that. And as you say, Rory, so many of the courses now are asking you to write about that in your final portfolio, in your submitted work, where you're going to explain your journey and evidence that you are growing, because we're called upon to grow, to be more insightful, to maybe be more accepting, to challenge our own barriers and those things that we hold as truths. I just wanted to throw one thing in, Rory, here. So you mentioned that you found yours up in your loft, and I just wanted to put in, for anybody that may be outside of the UK, a loft is an attic. It's the hole in the roof where you put the stuff. That's the loft. You may already know that, but I thought I'd put in the translation.
Yes. It's where we keep all the things we use once a year, e.g. the Christmas tree. But it really is an important part of it. And some tutors will have specific. Some tutors and some courses will have specific criteria around personal journals. For some, you'll just be asked to write a personal journal. It won't be marked or looked at by anybody, and it'll just be yours. And really, it's a trust issue. As a former tutor, I would say, please keep a personal journal. And I never looked at them, but I think it's a really good idea for personal development. Indeed, during certain lessons, I would hear some of my former students say, I'm going to journal that when I get home, because I think the art of writing something down helps you understand a lot better than maybe thinking it through. If you write it, it gives you a different perspective. And also it allows you to go back a few weeks or a few months, or in my case, a few years later, look at it and go, that's where I was then. And then you can think, well, where am I now? How have I worked with that? Some tutors and some courses will ask for a reflective journal as part of the criteria, in which case you need to be clear what it is they want, because there are different forms of reflection. There's writing things down in a diary format, and also there's like an action planning personal journal where you may say, well, this is your Kolb's learning cycle is a good example of that. A learning theorist called Kolb, where you start off with what you know, then you find information, then you decide how you're going to change with the use of that information, and the circle goes round and round. So you really need to be clear what it is your tutor's looking for. Is it a marked journal with certain criteria to be hit, or is it just a personal diary that you keep just as personal reflection?
Of course, as always, if you are in placement and you're working with clients, keep in mind confidentiality with what you write in your journal. You never know who might pick that up at whatever stage. So be mindful to respect that confidentiality. And then, as you said, Rory, so important to find out what the use of that journal is. I taught with Rory for a number of years, teaching students at practice level in counselling. And I wonder, I would feel a little uncomfortable, to be honest, but this is only me personally, in marking somebody else's personal journal. I don't know how you would mark personal development on that level, but that's just what comes up for me. So my personal journal was not required to be handed in, and I started writing my personal journal rather formally, I'll be honest, as if somebody else was going to read it. And it took me some time to realize this was just for me. It was my reflective journal. It was where I could put my feelings. I could put the things in my journal that I wouldn't maybe say to another human being. And I think that's important, because then you get to reread it back. And as you said, Rory, when you're writing, you use a different part of your brain to just simply thinking. If you're thinking, the process goes round and around and around in your head. As you write, it's almost like it has an outlet. It goes in a different direction, and you are using a different part of your brain. And there's a lot of evidence that goes to show that by writing things down, we retain the information better. It's easier to recall. But I have dyslexia. I hate writing. And I remember when I was going for job interviews back as a younger man, it was back in the days of fill in the form in the reception with a pen and a clipboard. And that brought up absolute nightmares for me. I would walk into the interview, and all I was thinking about was, what are they going to think when they look at that form and see all my spelling mistakes, when they see how untidy my handwriting is. My handwriting was untidy because I didn't like writing at school, because I am dyslexic. And I brought all of those barriers to my journal writing. And again, it took me a little while to realize it doesn't matter how I spell that word, because it's for me. It's about writing it down. It's not about it meeting somebody else's approval. And eventually I was writing as I would, freely, sentences that maybe sometimes wouldn't even make sense to somebody else looking at it. And I encourage you to explore freely your journal writing. But first, of course, make sure whether that has to be handed in or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up a couple of interesting points there, Ken. Not everybody can write. So it's quite a principled position. If that is a difficulty for you, to say to your tutor, can I record it? Or, can I do it in some other way? Well, I guess you could only write it or record it. But you could do that. And the other thing is, when I was training, one of my peers actually had her personal journal used against her in a divorce case.
Ow.
Her former husband, yes, Ken's waving his hands around as if he's wounded. It was awful. It was absolutely awful. And apparently he just found it and given it over to his solicitors, and they used it against her. So, if you have a personal journal, make sure that it's secure. It's your own. It's almost like emptying your head out onto a piece of paper, and make sure it's secure. Make sure you look after it. And, if you do that, and also that allows you then to write unaudited. I think that's really important, not to audit yourself, not to be afraid of putting things down, because that's the whole process of a journal, to be able to look at the good and the not so good, and to be able to kind of make sense of where you are in the world.
That really made my blood run cold when you mentioned that, Rory, because there is that fear that you're sharing. Well, not really sharing. You're writing it for yourself. You're sharing it with yourself, your innermost feelings, and somebody else looking at that without your permission. That is a massive breach of your confidentiality. Again, I come back to that. Be careful of mentioning client work because of that very reason. And the thing is, if you've written a journal and you've put it away and you're 5 years out of study, it's very easy to forget about that journal. It's very easy for that to end up in a box in a garage or whatever, and it can fall into the wrong hands very, very easily. So have a think about that. I know, Rory, you're pretty systemized. I know you mentioned yours are in the loft, and they're in the loft in a very specific box in a very specific place that you know exactly what is there. And I know that you have instructions that if anything should happen to you, that should be destroyed and got rid of. So think about that. It really is. It's your personal thoughts, feelings, and it is confidential. I think that's a good topic for the Facebook group. So if you're not a member of the Counselling Tutor Facebook group, please come and join us. Come and visit us. Get onto Facebook. Type in the word Counselling Tutor. You'll find us. We're right at the top. Knock on the door, because it is a private group. If you're a counsellor, a student of counselling or psychotherapy, we'll of course open the door for you. Come on in. If you're already in the group, I want to hear how you look after the security of your process notes or your reflective journal. I know they are different, but how do you look after the security of those? Are they in a locked box? Are they hidden away? I'd be interested to see that.
Yes, mine's under the Christmas tree, so if anybody breaks into my loft, don't look under the Christmas tree. That's what I would say.
Oh my goodness! So there you go. Hopefully that discussion will run strong, because it is an important topic. But moving now on to practice matters. And, practice matters for me is so important. It's actually, when I listen back, Rory, my favorite part of our podcast. And the reason for that is because it is real life stuff. It's not thinking of big ideas, it's actually practical stuff. And very often the stuff that you cover, Rory, in practice matters can seem like a topic that you don't necessarily need right now because you're studying and it's not going to be in your assignments. But believe me, the day a client on your third session says to you, yeah, well, I was in court yesterday because we're going through the blah, 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 blah. Like my blood ran cold a little earlier when you were talking about people using the journal, Rory. Your blood can run cold if you haven't thought about this and put action plans in place beforehand. These are things to think about before they come up, rather than scrambling around for the information after they have come up. So remind us again what you're going to be looking at today, Rory.
We're going to be looking at the process of working with the clients who may be going through a court case. We're going to be talking about what you need to think about, who you need to contact, and also a process of recontracting, which is essential if you're working with adults. It's essential if you're working with anybody, but if you're working with children, it's absolutely essential, because you can get into all sorts of difficulty if you've not got a clear idea of the processes you need to go through. And it comes under my general heading of hoping for the best and planning for the worst.
Practice matters after this short message.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Working with clients who are going through a court case. In recent years, more and more people are coming forward disclosing that they have been a victim of childhood sexual abuse, assault or rape. This is due to the heightened media attention of historical abuse and the police service being receptive and supportive of those reporting it. As a consequence, more and more cases are coming to court. In 2016, the Guardian newspaper reported that the number of reported rapes had risen by 123% since 2011-2012. This rise in reporting has also been mirrored in clients seeking counselling. In 2017, Survivors Manchester, a charity which supports male survivors of sexual abuse, reported a 50% rise in clients seeking counselling. These statistics means that more and more practitioners may be working with clients who are going through a court process, and as such, there are a few steps that need to be taken into consideration. So if you are working with a client who's going through a court process, the first thing may be to suggest to them that they speak with the police liaison officer, sometimes as a family liaison officer, sometimes as a police liaison officer, and inform them that they're having therapy. The liaison officer's job is to liaise between the families or the victim of the crime and all those people who are investigating and prosecuting it. And it is good practice to do so because it has to be disclosed to the defence and the prosecution. And there are, in some cases, times, and I've certainly been contacted by the police who've asked me to stop therapy with a client because the Crown Prosecution Service has asked me to do that. So that's something to take into consideration. You'll also most probably be asked for your notes or to appear in person at court. Now, if you are asked for your notes, it's worth remembering that the only people who can have access to your notes are the client themselves under the General Data Protection Regulations, or GDPR, a coroner, and a judge with a court order. Our colleagues in the police may very, very well phone up and ask for client notes, but it is a principal position to respectfully point out that the only people who can access the client's notes are in fact the client, a judge with a court order, and a coroner. And the police would know that, and they would be fine with that. When this has happened to me in my practice, the police we're absolutely fine with it. And sometimes if you ask the client and get the client's permission, you can send the notes on. So make sure that if the notes are sent, you get written authorization from the client and send them in a way that you can be sure is secure. In the past, I've sent notes via email, and I got an assurance from the person I was sending them to at the police that it was a secure email server. They sent that in writing, and I emailed the notes, but I also got authorization from the client, clear written authorization around what was being sent and the notes that were being sent. In some cases, clients may decline to have their notes sent, which is their prerogative. However, a judge in some cases can give a court order and you have to send them anyway. It's also a good policy to recontract to work with the client's feelings and not to discuss the case or anyone involved in it. One of the difficulties of working with a client who's going through a court process is that it could be put to the client, and indeed yourself as a therapist, that you coach them. So if you recontract just to work with what's going on for them and not to discuss anything about the case or anyone involved in it, you're usually quite safe. If anybody's got any concerns about it, you usually hear from the Crown Prosecution Service or the police liaison officer. I'd also suggest you discuss the case in supervision and take time to consider your approach. Recontract in a way that allows you to speak with the client and tell the client why you're working in such a way. And hopefully the police liaison people will explain to the client what they can and can't do in therapy. Some police liaison officers do, some don't. In my experience, police liaison officers are usually very clued up and will help the client and say, yes, it's okay to speak about that, but not about this. Sometimes you have to put that in writing as well to say that's how you've worked, so that if it ever comes up in court cases, you can't be accused, if you like, of coaching a client. And in fact, it's quite interesting. In the handout, which I suggest you download, there's lots of links to relevant information, and it discusses therapies that are accepted as useful for working with people who have survived sexual abuse, and therapies which the authorities take a bit of a dim view on, and that's hypnotherapy. And the reason for that is sometimes with hypnotherapy, you can get memories that may not be accurate. The other thing is speak with your insurance company before sending any confidential information. When I spoke to my insurance company, the times that I had to send information, they wanted to know chapter and verse. And they went through a checklist. Has your client authorised it to go? Who is it you've spoken to? Have you got all the details? Part of an insurance company's job is to manage risk. That's effectively what they are. They're risk managers. And a good insurance company, a good broker and a good insurance company will help you with that. Also, make sure that all communications with third parties, police, insurance companies, or the clients is written and you keep copies. That's absolutely essential, that you keep copies of absolutely everything. And the other thing that I'd say is that occasionally in my time as a therapist, I've had people phone up from mobile phone numbers asking, saying that they're the police or social workers, and would it be possible for me to send information? And my reaction to that is I never give any information over the phone to a mobile phone number, because mobile phone numbers can be owned by anybody. And there's been quite a few cases where I've just said, can you give me a landline? And I've Googled the landline and found out that it's a police station or that it's a social work department. I've got a named person and I've spoken to that person and confirmed they are who they are. And I must have done this, I don't know, quite a few times, I would say. There have been cases in the past, I can think of at least one occasion where somebody contacted me and they gave a number and it wasn't a landline number, and it certainly wasn't any form of organisation. And when I phoned the mobile phone number back, it was dead. That was clearly someone on a fishing expedition trying to find some information out. So the key thing is, if anybody phones you on a mobile phone, get a landline, find out where that landline's connected, and also make sure you've got a named person. In the handout, I've put a number of really good authority links that take you to the BACP website, talks about how to prepare yourself if you're working with a client who is going through a court process. And I would say, don't be frightened of it. It does happen, but as long as you, the client, and all the parties involved understand the situation, you're going to be fine. Finally, if you're working with children, you may have to get other stakeholders involved. It becomes rather complex. If you're working in an organisation as a school therapist, almost certainly you're going to have to speak to the head of safeguarding and get some sense of what the policies around that. And you may end up, as I did on a number of occasions, in multidisciplinary meetings where you might meet all the stakeholders. You're not discussing what the client's told you, but you are getting a sense of what you can and what you can't do in therapy. It's worth remembering that the legal system, and certainly in a criminal court, is a combative system where both the advocates who are defending and prosecuting are going to use the evidence to win, and they will do anything within their legal power to do that. So you really need to be careful, make sure that you dot the I's, cross the T's, and have all the information available to you. One final plea is that this podcast was made in September of 2018. Laws do change, so if you're listening to this in the future, it's certainly going to be worth you doing your own research. The information, I believe, is accurate at the time of broadcast, but we live in a very fast-paced society. Things change, so please do your own research and find out for yourself.
Thank you as always, Rory. So informative. And if you want to get Rory's super duper handout, you can do so. Rory creates a handout for all of the Practice Matters mini lectures, and you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com. That's the UK spelling with 2 L's in counselling, counsellingtutor.com. On the Counselling Tutor page, you'll be warmly welcomed. And if you look at the top on the navigation bar, you will see podcasts. Click on podcasts and make your way to episode 88. That's today's episode. And you can download Rory's super duper handout for free from within that page. The page also contains all the other notes from today's session, including any links that we may mention. And of course, if you are already a member of our paid for resource, which is called the Counselling Study Resource, then that handout has already been added to your handouts vault. So no need to put in your name and email to get that sent to you. You just log in and you have access to that. And if you're wondering what is the Counselling Study Resource, well, we did mention it just before Practice Matters, and we will mention where you can find more information on that at the end of today's episode. But moving now into an interesting topic of disclosing personal problems during training. And let's face it, life doesn't all of a sudden become magical and marvelous when you go into counselling training. Life continues to be life, and we can experience loss, we can experience grief, we can have things come up during our training that kind of reminds us of something that may have happened in our past. What do you do about that?
Yes, and I think there's one word that really underscored that really kind of gives us a sense of what's important here, and that's trust. Because, you may be going into classes for the first time. At the time of recording this podcast, it's really at the beginning of the academic year. People are forming new groups, meeting new people. And the whole thing is a trust-building exercise for a good few weeks, indeed for some, throughout the arc of their studies. And it is literally about building trust. And sometimes people have real difficulties. As a tutor and as a former student, I'm aware of people have confided in me about real difficulties they're going through. And the question really, and it was asked in our Facebook group, is should you disclose personal problems to your group? Well, my take on this is that you need to think about if you have really big difficulties, do you need to gain some other form of support? Maybe you need your own therapy. Maybe you need more practical support. The other thing is about trusting. We'd like to think that everybody in a counselling group are trustworthy people. I'm sure they are. But for some people, it may be difficult talking about issues to certain members. So if you are going to share personal information, you need to be thoughtful of who you're going to be talking to. And the fact that although there's a group contract, it's possible that information may get out. That's the truth of the matter. We always used to contract when Ken and myself taught for what's said in the room stays in the room within the limits of the law and the college's policies and procedures. But the reality is that sometimes people do talk. So yeah, it's about who you trust. And maybe if you're having real big difficulties, it may be useful to speak to your tutor, because your tutor may be able to give you some insight and direction of where you may be able to get help. But it does happen, and I've heard some real difficult stories talked about in skills sessions. It's, that does happen. We've heard it a lot, Ken, haven't we?
Indeed. And I look back to my own training where I did feel that I was in a trusting group, and I shared some stuff that I'd not shared with anybody. But I felt safe to do so within the group. And it's about that group, understanding the group. How does that group feel for you? And then keeping that caveat in mind that Rory said, what happens if it does leak out? And take that into consideration. But here it is. Things happen, life happens. You can lose a job. You can lose a parent, a loved one, can pass away during your training. These things happen. It's part of life. What do you do with that? Go to your tutor, I think, is a great start. Go into personal counselling. There's so many courses in the UK that require personal counselling of at least 10 sessions as a requirement for the course. You don't do the counselling, you don't get your qualification. And it's in place so that you have that opportunity to take the stuff that comes up for you to speak to somebody else. You may not be at the practice level in your studies. You may be on a level 3 where you're not required to do that additional counselling. there's nothing stopping you from keying into local counselling services in your area, going and speaking to a counsellor, and of course, as you say, Rory, speaking to your tutor. And at the end of the day, the tutor is there to be warm and accepting, but also to make sure, specifically if you are in contact with clients, that you are best able to serve those clients without doing yourself any damage. And sometimes when we face catastrophes, when we face difficulties in our own lives, we can become tunneled and blinkered, and having that extra set of eyes so important. And I want to say this doesn't just pertain to studying. This is about when you are in practice as well. I was in practice, and I'll happily share this. I lost my mother while I was in practice, and I was tutoring at the time as well. And I think I missed one session of tutoring. And I think I missed one or two sessions of counselling, and I took on superhero syndrome, where I thought, you know what, I can still do this, until I went to my supervisor and started speaking, and my supervisor pretty much took me out of practice for a little while, and I'm so grateful for that. I was out of practice for 9 months, and it was only after stepping out of practice that I was truly able to deal with my own grief and see it for what it was, because I was blinded before that.
Absolutely, and sometimes we need a good enough other to help us with that. In your case, that was your supervisor, Ken, who kind of help you with that. Also, personal development groups are an ideal place to talk about issues that may be difficult for you. And the thing with personal development groups, not always, but sometimes they're split, so they're smaller groups. So it may be easier to talk. And usually they're self-selecting groups. So in a personal development group, usually, not all the time, you select your own group. So you're basically selecting who you're comfortable with to speak about issues of difficulty. And as you're right, Ken, there may be some issues that come up which would stop someone being an effective counsellor. If someone had quite intrusive mental health issues, such as psychosis or, very, very difficult depression, you have to take a view, as you did, can you practice well being like you are? Because, we have to be well enough to be able to hold and work with our clients' difficulties. And there's no shame in saying, I'm going to have to step away. You don't have to leave your studies. You don't have to leave your studies. When I had a loss halfway through my training, I didn't leave my studies, but I stepped away from practice for a little while just to check myself out. And it just meant that my hours, it took a little longer for me to get my hours. But, look after yourself, because ours is a profession that you need to look after yourself, because if you don't, you'll burn out. You will burn out, and that's never a good thing.
100%. And there's a theme here, as often there is. Rory sets the topics for our podcast, and you'll notice we started off speaking about reflective journal writing, and we end off speaking about personal issues and disclosure. You see that it kind of links up there. This has been episode 88 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, kicking off with reflective journal writing. In Practice Matters, Rory discussed working with clients who are going through a court case. And of course, we ended today disclosing personal problems during your training.
Yes, and as always, and very poignant for this episode, stay grounded and really, really stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.